It is rather difficult to recollect everything that happened in one's life at an advanced age. Time has erased from memory many things, especially those relating to childhood and youth. I remember only that which is unforgettable. I was born on November 19th, Old Style, 1896, in a house that stood in the middle of the village of Strelkovka in Kaluga province. It was an old house, one corner of which had sunk deep into the ground. The outer walls and the roof were overgrown with moss and grass. It consisted of but one room with 2 windows. My parents did not know who had built it and when. Old-timers said it had once been the home of one Anna Zhukova, a childless widow. To comfort herself, she had adopted a 2-year-old boy from an orphanage who was to become my father. Nobody could say who his real parents were, and my father, too, made no attempt to learn. It was known only that he had been left at the door of the orphanage at the age of 3 months, with a note attached, in which his mother asked that the boy be called Constantin. Why the poor woman abandoned her child, no one can tell. It was hardly because of a lack of maternal feelings, and most probably because of her dire plight. Father's adoptive mother died when he was barely 8. He was apprenticed to a cobbler in the large village of Ugodsky Zavod. He told us that his learning boiled down to sundry household chores, to running errands, caring for his master's children, and even herding cattle. After 3 years of this learning, he went looking for a new place. In Moscow, he eventually found a position with a shoemaker named Weiss, who had his own shop. I do not know the details, but from what my father told me, after the revolutionary events of 1905, he, along with many other workmen, was sacked and deported from Moscow for taking part in demonstrations. Ever since, to the day of his death in 1921, he stayed in the village, turning his hand to cobbling and farming. My mother, Ustinia Artemyevna, was born into a poverty-stricken family in the neighbouring village of Chernaya Griaz. When my parents married, mother was 35 and father 50. For both, it was their second marriage. Their first spouses died soon after marriage. Mother was physically very strong. She easily picked up a 200-pound sack of grain and carried it for some distance. It was said she had inherited her strength from my grandfather, Artem, who would stand under a horse and lift it up on his back, or take a horse by the tail and force it down on its haunches with one quick tug. Our desperate poverty, with father earning a miserable pittance by cobbling, made mother earn a little extra by carting loads. She worked in the fields all spring, summer, and early autumn, and then, in late autumn, went to the district seat of Maloyaroslavets for groceries, which she carted to shopkeepers in Ugodsky Zavod. She never got more for a trip than a ruble or a ruble 20, which, considering that she had to pay for her food and fodder for the horses, a place to sleep over in town, shoe repairs, etc., yielded an amount that was probably less than the alms beggars collected in the same time. But there was nothing to be done. Such was the lot of the poor. Mother meekly bore this heavy lot to keep body and soul together, like many other women in our villages. Despite the cold and the mud, the womenfolk drove out to Maloyaroslavets, Serpukhov, and elsewhere, leaving their small children in the care of the old people, who could hardly move themselves. Most of the peasants in our parts were poor. They had little land, and what they had yielded poor harvests. Farm work was done chiefly by women, children, and old people. The menfolk earned something on the side in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities. Seldom did any of them return with more or less decent earnings. Certainly there were also rich farmers, the kulaks. They were quite well off. They lived in comfortable, well-furnished cottages, had a yard full of cattle and poultry, and large stocks of flour and grain in their barns. Their children dressed and ate well and attended fine schools. These were the people for whom our poor folk slaved, working just for bread, fodder, or seed. Meanwhile, we, the children of the poor, saw how hard our mothers had it and grieved over their tears, and how happy we were to get a bun or a piece of gingerbread from our mothers when they returned from Maloyaroslavets. If a little money was saved, and there were pastries for Christmas or Easter, there was no end to our delights. I was 5, and my sister was getting on for 7, when a kid brother whom my parents christened Alexei was born. He was frail, and we feared that he would not live. Mother sobbed and said, "How can he grow strong when all we have is bread and water?" A few months after giving birth, she decided to resume her carter's trade. Her neighbours tried to dissuade her, advising her not to wean the child from her breast as he was still very weak. However, if not for Mother's earnings, the entire family would starve. So she had to go. Alexei was left in our care. He did not live long, less than a year. We buried him in autumn in the Yugodsky Zavod graveyard. My sister and I, let alone father and mother, grieved bitterly and often went to his graveside. That year, one more misfortune befell us. The roof of our house caved in with age. "We must get out," Father said, "or the house will collapse altogether and kill us. We can make do in our shed while it's still warm outdoors. Then we'll see. Perhaps someone will put us up in a bathhouse or hayloft." I remember how Mother cried when she told us, "There's nothing we can do, children. Help carry our stuff over to the shed." Father contrived a small stove for cooking, and we took up quarters in the shed. Father's friends came round for the housewarming and jokingly remarked, "Looks as if you couldn't come to terms with the goblins in your house, and they chased you out." "What do you mean?" Father retorted. "They would have squashed us in our beds if I couldn't." "Well, what are you going to do?" asked Father's friend and neighbour. "Can't think of anything." "What's there to think about?" Mother intervened. "We'll have to sell our cow, that's all. And for the money, we can buy logs for a cabin. If we don't do it now, summer will be gone, and it'll be too late putting up a cabin in winter." "She's right," the men said. "That might all be true," Father said, "but the money we'll get for our cow won't be enough, and all we have besides it is our old nag." Nothing was said. Everyone understood that for us the worst still lay ahead. A little later, Father managed to buy logs for a small cabin at a more or less passable price, partly on credit. The neighbours helped to bring them in, and by November the cabin was up. We thatched the roof with straw. "Never mind, we'll get along somehow. When we get rich, we'll put up something better," Mother said. On the outside, the house looked worse than the others. The porch was nailed together of old warped boards, and instead of window panes we had bits and pieces of glass. But we were all very happy that we would have a warm place in winter. As for the crowded conditions, as the saying goes, to be crowded isn't to be buried. In the autumn of 1902, I turned 6. The winter, which came early that year, was a horrible time for our family. The crops had failed, and we had grain to last only until mid-December. All that our parents earned barely sufficed to buy bread and salt and to pay the debts. We had our neighbours to thank for helping us out now and again with a pot of cabbage soup or porridge. The principle of helping one's neighbour was not an exception, but rather a tradition of friendship and solidarity that reigned among poverty-stricken Russians. When spring came, we fared better. The fishing that year in the Lubyanka and Protva was especially good. The Ogublyanka was a small, shallow stream, badly overgrown with slime. Upstream, beyond the village of Kostinka, and nearer to Bolotsky, where several brooks drained into the river, the waters ran deep and larger fish could be caught. In the neighbourhood of our village and the neighbouring village of Ogub, the stream teemed with roach, perch and tench, which we trapped mostly with baskets. On especially lucky days, I could repay the neighbours with fish for their soup and porridge. However, we boys liked fishing in the Protva, near Mikhailova Hills. The road there led through dense groves of lime trees and lovely thickets of birch, which abounded in strawberries and, towards late summer, in mushrooms. Folk from nearby villages came to these thickets to strip the trees of bark for their bast shoes, which were known in local parlance as the latest in checkered footwear. The groves and thickets are gone. The Nazis chopped them down during the war, and after the war the collective farm brought the land under the plough. One day in summer Father said, "You're a big boy, nearly 7. It's time you did something. When I was your age I worked as hard as a grown-up. Tomorrow you'll come out haymaking. You and your sister will rake and stack the hay." I liked the idea. I had been out to the hay meadows before. Now, however, I knew I would be doing something useful. In fact, I was proud that I was now able to help my family. On the other carts, I saw my playmates. They too had pitchforks in their hands. I laboured with great zeal and was happy to hear the praise of my elders. But I overreached myself. My hands were soon covered with blisters. I was ashamed to admit it, though, bearing the pain as long as I could. Then the blisters burst, and I could no longer work. "Cheer up, it'll pass," Father said as he bandaged my hands with a rag. For several days I could not handle the pitchfork, and only helped my sister stack the hay. My playmates snickered, but soon the blisters healed, and I kept up with the best of them. When harvest time came, Mother said, "It's time you learned to reap. I've bought a brand new sickle for you, and tomorrow morning we'll go out to reap." For a time, things went smoothly until misfortune again befell me. I wanted to show my worth, fumbled, and cut the little finger of my left hand. Mother was terribly frightened, and so was I. Luckily, a neighbour of ours, Aunt Praskovia, happened to be nearby. She applied a poultice of plantain leaf and tightly bandaged the finger. Many years have passed, but the scar remains as a reminder of my early mishap at farming. The summer of work was soon over. I had got the knack of the job and also grew physically stronger. The autumn of 1903 was close, and I was due to start school. Like my playmates, I was preparing for it, trying to learn the ABC from my sister's tattered primer. That autumn, another 5 boys from the village were to start school with me. Among them was my bosom friend, Alexei Koloturny. Actually, Kulturny was a nickname, for his real name was Zhukov. We had 5 families in the village by the name of Zhukov, and the only way we distinguished between them was by using the mother's Christian names. We were known as Ustinias, others as Avdotias, or say Tatianas, and so on. We were to go to the parish school in Velichkova, a village a mile away, attended by boys and girls from the 4 villages of Likovo, Strelkovska, Ogub, and Velichkovo itself. Some of the children had satchels of which they were very proud. Alexei and I had hand-sewn burlap bags instead. I said to Mother that these were the kind of bags beggars carried, and I would not go to school with it. "As soon as Father and I earn the money," Mother replied, "we'll buy you a satchel. Meanwhile, you'll have to make do with the bag." My sister Masha, who was in the 2nd form, took me to school. We had 15 boys and 13 girls in our form. After making our acquaintance, the schoolmaster assigned us to our seats, placing the girls on the left and the boys on the right. I wanted to sit at the same desk as Alexei, but the teacher said that since Alexei did not know a single letter as yet and was small, he would have a seat up front, while I was put at the back. After school, Alexei told me he would try to learn the alphabet quickly so that we could sit together, but that never came to pass. He was invariably at the bottom of the class and was often detained after hours for not knowing his lessons. Being a very docile sort of chap, he was never sore at his teachers. Our schoolmaster was Sergei Nikolaevich Remizov, a fine person and an experienced teacher. He never punished anyone without reason and never raised his voice. He was respected and obeyed by his pupils. His father was a priest, a very quiet and kind old man who taught us scripture. Sergei Nikolaevich and his brother, Nikolai Nikolaevich, a doctor, were atheists and attended church services merely for appearance's sake. The 2 brothers sang in the church choir. Alexei and I both had good voices and were included in the school choir. All the boys from our village were moved up to the 2nd form with good marks. All except Alexei, who, despite our collective assistance, flunked scripture. My sister also failed and stayed in Form 2 for a 2nd year. Our parents resolved that it would be better for her to quit school entirely and look after the house. Masha cried bitterly, arguing that she was not to blame, that she was not promoted because she had missed many lessons caring for our kid brother Alexei when Mother was carting. I stood up for my sister, stating that though the parents of the other children were also working, none of them took their children away from school, and that all my sister's playmates would be continuing school. Eventually, Mother gave in, making my sister very happy. I was also glad for her. We were sorry for Mother. Though we were still children, we knew that she was having a very hard time. Besides, father, who was in Moscow to earn some money, sent us very little, and that irregularly. Previously, he had been able to send us 2 or 3 rubles a month, but of late he would send no more than a ruble now and then, or even less. The neighbours told us that everyone in Moscow was drawing paltry pay nowadays. In late 1904, father came home. My sister and I were happy and expected him to give us presents he had brought from the city. But our hopes were dashed. Father had come home after 20 days in the hospital, following an appendectomy, and had had to borrow his fare home. Father was respected by his fellow villagers. They always heeded his advice. At village assemblies, he usually had the last say. I adored father, and he spoiled me. Still, now and again he punished me for some fault, taking it out on me with his belt and demanding an apology. I was stubborn, and no matter how hard he thrashed me, I bit my lips and never asked for pardon. One day he gave me such a flogging that I ran away from home and spent 3 days hiding in a neighbour's hemp field. Only my sister knew where I was. She kept my hiding place a secret and brought me things to eat. My parents hunted high and low for me, but did not find me. Then a neighbour stumbled on me and took me home. Father gave me one more licking, then took pity and pardoned me. I remember how one day, when father was in a good mood, he took me to have tea with him at the tavern in the neighbouring village of Ogub. The proprietor, Nikifor Kulagin, the rich man of the village, also kept a grocery store. The menfolk and the young chaps were fond of congregating there to discuss the news, play a game of cards or lotto, or have a drop, whether there was an occasion for it or not. I liked having tea at the tavern with the grown-ups, who told so many things about Moscow and St. Petersburg. I said to father I would always keep him company when he went there so I could listen to grown-up talk. One of the waiters at the tavern was my godmother's brother Prokhor. He had a lame leg, and everybody called him Limping Proshka. He was an avid hunter, however, shooting ducks in summer and hares in winter. The neighbourhood abounded with them at the time. Prokhor took me with him pretty often. I was jubilant, especially when he bagged a hare I had flushed. We went to the Ogublyanka, or the lake. Prokhor never missed, and it was my job to retrieve the ducks from the water. I still love hunting. Possibly it had been Prokhor who taught me to love it. Father soon went to Moscow again. Before he left, he told mother that factory workers in Moscow and St. Petersburg, driven to desperation by unemployment and ruthless exploitation, were going on strike more and more often. "Better keep out of it," mother said, "or else the cops'll have you." "With us workers," father replied, "it's one for all and all for one." For a long time we heard nothing from him and were terribly worried. Soon we learned that in St. Petersburg, on January 9th, Tsarist troops and the police had shot a peaceful procession of workers who had come to ask the Tsar to grant them better conditions. In the spring of the same year, 1905, strangers began to frequent the villages. These were political agitators who urged the people to rise up against the landowners and Tsarist autocracy. Although in our village the peasants staged no revolt, there was great ferment. They knew of the political strikes, the street fighting, and the December 1905 armed uprising in Moscow. They also knew that the uprising, as well as working-class action in Moscow and other cities of Russia, had been harshly suppressed by the Tsarist government, and that many of the revolutionaries had been murdered, incarcerated, or sentenced to hard labour. They had heard, too, about Lenin, the man who spoke for the interests of the workers and peasants, the leader of the Bolshevik Party, a party that sought to deliver the toiling folk from the Tsarist regime, the landed proprietors, and the capitalists. All this information was brought by our fellow villagers earning a few rubles on the side in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities and towns of Russia. Father returned home in 1906. He said he would not go to Moscow any more as the police had forbidden him to live in the city, allowing him to reside only in his home village. I was happy father had come back home for good. That year I finished the 3-year parish school. I had top marks in all forms and was awarded honours. The family rejoiced at my progress, and I was happy too. To mark the occasion, mother presented me with a new shirt, while father made me a pair of boots. "Now that you know your letters," he said, "we can apprentice you to learn some trade in Moscow. "Let him stay here another year or so," Mother remarked. "Let him grow up a bit." In the autumn of 1907, I turned 11. I knew that it was my last autumn at home, and that when winter passed, I would be apprenticed. I had many cares at home. Mother made frequent trips to town for goods for the shopkeepers, while Father slaved at his cobbling from early morning till late at night. His earnings were negligible because, owing to their poverty, the village folk could seldom pay for the job. Mother often nagged Father for charging them so little. But whenever Father did turn a few extra rubles making a pair of boots, he usually came home from Yugodsky Zavod tipsy. Sister and I would go out to meet him on the way, and he would always have a bun or some sweets for us. In winter, whenever I had spare time, I mostly went out fishing, skating on homemade runners, or skiing from the Mikhailova hills. At last, the summer of 1908 arrived. My heart ached at the thought that I would soon have to part with kith and kin and leave for Moscow. I was conscious that my childhood was over, if of course my earlier years could be called that, though I naturally could not expect anything better. As I remember, one evening the neighbours came to discuss the apprenticing of their children in Moscow. Some said they would send off their children in the next few days, while others said they would wait until their offspring were a year or two older. Mother announced that she would take me there after the fair that we usually had at the village a week after Trinity Sunday. My pal, Alexei Kolotyany, had already been apprenticed to the joinery of one Murashkin, a rich cabinet maker in our village. Father asked me what trade I wanted to learn. I said I wanted to be a printer. Father knew no one who would help apprentice me at a printer's, so Mother said she would ask her brother Mikhail to take me on as an apprentice furrier. Father agreed, as furriers earned pretty well. I was ready to take up any job so long as I could help the family. A few words about my uncle, Mikhail Artemyevich Pilikin, who visited the neighbouring village of Chernaya Griaz in July 1908. Like Mother, he grew up in poverty. At the age of 11, Mikhail was apprenticed to a furrier's. 4.5 years later, he became adept at the trade. He was thrifty, and after several years had enough money put aside to start a small business of his own. He was a good furrier and had a steady, rich clientele whom he fleeced mercilessly. Little by little, he built up his business until he had 8 craftsmen working for him, as well as 4 boy apprentices, all of whom he ruthlessly exploited. In this way he hoarded up some 50,000 rubles. Mother persuaded this brother of hers to take me on. She went to see him in the village of Chernaya Griaz, where he was spending the summer, and on her return told me that her brother wanted to have a look at me. Father asked about the terms. "You know what they are," Mother said. 4.5 years before he'll be articled. "There is nothing we can do about it," Father said. "He'll have to go." 2 days later, Father took me to Chernaya Griaz. As we walked up to the house where the Pilikins lived, Father said, "Look, that's your future boss on the porch. When you come up, bow to him and say, 'Good morning, Mikhail Artemyevich.'" "I better say, 'Good morning, Uncle Misha,'" I replied. "Forget he's your uncle. He'll be your boss, and rich people have no liking for poor relatives. Keep that in mind." As we approached the porch, on which my future master slouched in a cane chair, Father greeted him and shoved me forward. Pilikin did not deign to reply, and did not offer his hand to Father. As he turned to me, I bowed and said, "Good morning, Mikhail Artemyevich." "Hello, lad. So you've decided to be a furrier?" I said nothing. "It's a good trade, but not easy to learn." "He's not afraid of hardships," Father said. "He's used to working hard." "Know your letters?" Father displayed my honours certificate. "Good for you," Uncle said, and then, turning towards the doorway, shouted, "Hey, lazy good-for-nothings, come here!" His 2 richly dressed plump sons, Alexander and Nikolai, emerged, followed by my uncle's wife. "Look at this, you savages," he said, showing them my honours certificate. "That's how you must learn instead of just scrapping by." Then he said, finally addressing Father, "Well, I think I'll take your lad. He seems a husky boy and looks as if he is no fool. I'll be here a few more days. After that I'll be leaving for Moscow, but I can't take him with me. My brother-in-law Sergei will do that when he goes to Moscow in a week. That was that. I was glad I had another week at home. Well, how did my darling brother receive you? Mother asked. You know the sort of welcome bosses give our kind. Did he offer you tea? Why, he didn't even ask us to sit after the long road. He sat while we stood like soldiers on parade. Then Father added, We don't need his tea. Me and the boy'll drop in at the tavern and have tea for our own hard-earned coppers. Mother gave me a bun, and off we went to the tavern. It did not take long to pack. Mother gave me some underclothes, a couple of footcloths and a towel, as well as 6 eggs and some pancakes to eat on the way. After prayers, we sat down for a moment of silence, according to the good old Russian custom. Well, Sonny, God bless you, Mother said. She hugged me to her bosom, and tears welled up in her eyes. I saw Father's eyes grow red, and a couple of tears roll down his cheeks. I could hardly restrain myself, but managed not to cry. Mother and I went on foot to Chernaya Griaz. Previously, I had followed the road to school and to the woods for berries and mushrooms. Remember, Mum, how I cut my little finger when out reaping by those 3 oaks? Of course I remember, son. Mothers always remember what happens to their children. Wicked are the children who forget their mothers. It won't happen to me, Mum, I said firmly. Uncle Sergei and I had just boarded the train when the rain came down in sheets. It was dark inside, just one tallow candle barely picking out the narrow corridor in our third-class coach. The train pulled out, and through the window I glimpsed the dark outline of the woods and the lights of remote villages. I had never ridden in a train before, in fact, had never seen a railway. You can imagine how impressed I was. We passed Balabanovo station, and then there suddenly loomed brightly lit tall buildings. What's this town? I asked an elderly gentleman standing by the window. That's no town, boy. That's Sava Morozov's Naro-Fominsk textile mills. I worked there for 15 years. Now I work there no longer. Why so? It's a long story. I buried my wife and daughter there. His face grew pale, and for an instant he closed his eyes. Each time I go past those cursed mills, I just can't look calmly at the monster that swallowed my dear ones. He moved away from the window, sat down in a dark corner, and lit a cigarette. I continued staring at the monster which swallows people, but did not dare ask the gentleman how it did that. We reached Moscow at daybreak. We had travelled over 4 hours. These days it takes a little over 1 hour. I was stunned by the hustle and bustle at the railway station. Crowds were rushing towards the exit, pushing and shoving with elbows, baskets, bags and trunks. I could not understand why everybody was in such a hurry. "Stop gaping," my uncle said. "This is no village. You've got to look alive here." Finally, we emerged onto the square in front of the railway station. Outside the tavern, a brisk trade was being done in hot mead, pancakes and pastries stuffed with liver and entrails for a cheap snack. It was still too early to go to my master, so we went to the tavern. We made our way across puddles and mud and past tattered drunks sitting or lying on the pavement or right on the ground. Inside there was loud music, and I recognized a familiar tune. Some of the customers, who had had a drink or two, took up the refrain in a ragged chorus. Our tea over, we went to Bolshaya Dorogomilovskaya to wait for the horse car. There was no tram there yet, which at the time was new to Moscow. In the haste of climbing up to the deck, a passenger accidentally hit me with the heel of his boot. My nose bled. "I told you, you've got to look lively," Uncle Sergei grumbled, while the man who had hit me gave me a rag and said, "You're from the country, I suppose? Here in Moscow you've got to look out for yourself." I was not particularly impressed with the railway station square or the adjacent streets. The houses were small and squalid, while the street itself was filthy, heavily rutted, with many drunks and people, for the most part, poorly clad. But the closer we came to the heart of the city, the more its appearance changed. I saw large houses, smart-looking shops and rich carriages. I was in a daze, looked about me in confusion, and felt a bit depressed. Never before had I seen houses over 2 stories high, paved streets, and carriages with pneumatic tyres drawn at great speed by handsome horses. Nor had I seen such crowds of people. All of it stunned my imagination. I gaped in silence, listening to Uncle Sergei with but half an ear. We turned into Bolshaya Dimitrovka, now Pushkinskaya, and got off the horse car at the corner of Kamagursky Lane, now Art Theatre Lane. "That's the house you're going to live in," Uncle Sergei said. "In the yard is the workshop. That's where you're going to work. The main entrance is from the lane, but the craftsmen and apprentices use the back door. Make a note of everything I tell you. That there is Kuznetsky Most, the best shopping street in Moscow, and that's the Zimin Playhouse, but no working folk go there. Further down and to the right is Okotny Ryad, where the greengrocers, butchers and fishmongers are. You'll run errands there for the master's missus." Passing through the big courtyard, we approached the craftsmen and exchanged greetings. Uncle Sergei respectfully tipped his hat to everyone. "Here's a new apprentice for you," he said. "From the country." "He looks rather small," somebody observed. "Ought to have grown a bit." "How old are you, lad?" a tall man asked. 12, I replied. "Yes, he's rather small, but he looks broad in the shoulders. Cheer up, boy. You'll be a good furrier when you grow up," an old craftsman said gently. This was Fyodor Ivanovich Kolesov, a very fair man, as I learned later, and an experienced furrier whom the others held in great esteem. Taking me aside, Uncle Sergei indicated each craftsman and apprentice by name, and gave me a few particulars about them. I well remember the Mishin brothers. "The elder one's good at the trade, but drinks too much," Uncle Sergei said, "and the younger is terribly stingy. They say he spends only 10 kopecks a day on his meals, keeps dreaming of starting his own business. That fellow is Mikhailo," Uncle Sergei went on. "He drinks too, and very heavily. After payday he's drunk morning, day and night for 2 or 3 days running, and will give the shirt off his back for vodka. But he's top-notch at the trade." "And that there is the senior apprentice," Uncle Sergei indicated a tall boy. "He's directly over you, name of Kuzma. His apprenticeship will be up in a year's time. The curly-headed fellow over there is Grigory Matveyev, hails from the village of Trubino and is a distant relative of yours." We climbed up a murky and filthy staircase to the first floor and entered the workshop. My master's wife came out, said hello, and added that the master wasn't in. He was expected shortly. "Come," she said, "I'll show you the layout, and then you'll have dinner in the kitchen." She went on to detail my future duties as the youngest of the apprentices. I had to tidy up the rooms, polish the shoes of my master's family, including those of the children, and light the incense burners in front of the icons. "As for your other duties, Kuzma and Matriosha, the forewoman, will tell you what you have to do." After that, Kuzma called me to dinner in the kitchen. I was rather hungry by then, and willingly set to. But here an unforeseen mishap occurred. I did not know the rule that we ate our cabbage soup from the common pot without the meat, and were allowed a piece of meat only towards the end, after the forewoman tapped on the pot. I fished out and gobbled down a couple of pieces, and was about to go for my third, when all of a sudden I was hit on the head with a spoon so hard that a swelling rose at once. I felt taken aback to find myself beaten twice in my first half a day in Moscow. Kuzma turned out to be a good chap. "Grin and bear it when you're beaten," he whispered to me after dinner. "A beaten man is worth 2 who aren't." That day, Kuzma took me on a round of the nearest shops, which I would go to for tobacco and vodka for the craftsmen. Meanwhile, Matriosha, who also cooked for us, showed me how to wash the dishes and start the samovar. The next morning I was given a seat in the corner and told that I would first have to learn to sew. The forewoman provided me with needle, thread and thimble, instructed in the art, and said, "If things don't go right, come to me, and I'll show you how to do it." I applied myself to my task with diligence. Work started at 7 a.m. sharp and stopped at 7 p.m. There was an hour's break for dinner. This meant an 11-hour day, but when there was much work, the craftsmen stayed overtime until as late as 11 o'clock at night. In that case, the day could be 15 hours long. They received additional piece rates for this. We apprentices had to be out of bed at 6 in the morning. After a quick wash under the tap, we got ready the workbenches and everything else that the furriers might need. We turned in at 11 in the evening, after everything had been tidied up and prepared for the next day, sleeping on the floor in the workshop and in very cold weather, on bunks in the hall inside the back entrance. At the beginning, I tired quickly. I couldn't get used to staying up late. Back home, we went to bed very early. But in time, I grew accustomed to the heavy day, bearing up stoically. At the beginning, I was overwhelmed with nostalgia, recollecting the groves and thickets where I had gone hunting with Procor, or berrying and mushrooming with Sister. My heart ached, and I wanted to cry. I thought I would never see my parents, sister, and playmates again. Apprentices were let off home for a holiday only after 3 years of work, and it seemed as if the time would never come. On Saturdays, Kuzma took us to Vespers, and on Sundays to Matins and Mass. On big holidays, our master took us to Mass at the Kremlin Assumption Cathedral, or sometimes to the big Cathedral of the Saviour. We did not like going to church, always looking for a chance to escape. Assumption Cathedral was an exception, of course, for there we enjoyed the glorious choir, and were especially eager to hear Deacon Rozov, who had a voice like a trumpet. A year passed. I made fairly good progress in the rudiments of the furrier's trade, though it was not at all easy. Our master beat us pitilessly for the slightest mistake. We were beaten by the craftsmen, the craftswomen, and the mistress too. Whenever the master was out of sorts, it was better to avoid him, as he would hit out at us so severely that one felt a ringing in the ears for the rest of the day. Now and again the master would make 2 of the boys beat one another with branches of honeysuckle, used to curry fur, and would mutter, "Harder, harder." We had to submit to this without demurral. We knew that bosses always tanned their apprentices. Such was the way of things. Our master held that he had us apprentices at his full service, that no one could take him to task for the inhuman treatment of children. Indeed, no one ever took any interest in our working conditions, in what we ate and how we lived. Our supreme judge was our master. So we slaved and sweated, though not every adult would have borne it. Time passed. I turned 13 and had already learned much. Though I was run off my feet, I nevertheless found time to read. Always, I gratefully remember my schoolmaster, Sergei Nikolaevich Remizov, who had infected me with a passion for reading. In this, I was helped by Alexander, my master's elder boy. He was of the same age as I and treated me better than the others. With his help, I read a novel entitled The Nurse, the full Pinkerton and Sherlock Holmes series, and some other adventure stories. This was interesting, but not very edifying. Yet I wanted to learn, only I did not know how. I confided in Alexander, who approved and said he would help. We undertook further studies of Russian, maths, and geography, and read popular books on science. We usually did this together, for the most part on Sundays, and when the master was out. Though we took great pains to conceal our studies from him, he nevertheless found us out. I thought he would kick me out or give me a good hiding. For some reason, however, I do not know why, he commended us for doing a sensible thing. I applied myself to these studies for more than a year on my own, and then entered a night school which provided a course of instruction equivalent to that of a city school. The craftsmen were pleased with me, as was my master, though from time to time he would still strike or kick me. He did not want to let me go to the night school at first, but his sons prevailed on him to agree. I was very happy. True, I had to do my lessons at night on the bunk, near the toilet where a dim bulb burned all night. A month before my final exams, on a Sunday, when our master had left to visit friends, we sat down to a game of cards. Blackjack it was, as I remember. We did not notice how he returned and came to the kitchen. I was the dealer and had a run of luck. All of a sudden I got a resounding bash on the ear. Startled, I looked up and was horrified to see the master. I was so stunned that I could not say a word. All the other boys vanished. "So that's what you want an education for?" he shouted. "To count the pips. There'll be no more school for you, my lad, and I won't let Alexander help you." A couple of days later, I called at my school on Tverskaya Street and told them what had happened. I had only a little more than a month to go. I was laughed at but allowed to take the exams, which I successfully passed. By now it was 1911. I had done 3 years of my apprenticeship and was now a senior with 3 smaller boys under me. I was familiar with Moscow because I took parcels to various addresses all over town more often than the others. I wanted to continue my studies but had not the slightest opportunity. Still, I managed to keep up with my reading. I read the papers after old man Kolesov, who was better informed in politics than the others. I got some magazines from cousin Alexander and bought my own books with money saved on tram fares. Now and again my master would send me with a parcel somewhere further out and give me a couple of coppers for the tram. I would walk the distance and save the money. In my 4th year, as the strongest of the apprentices, my master took me along to the famous fair in Nizhny Novgorod, now the city of Gorky. He had rented a stall there for wholesale trading in furs. By that time he had grown exceedingly rich, acquired good connections, and was more avaricious than before. My duties at the fair were mostly to crate the lots sold and dispatch them to consignees via the wharves on the Volga or Oka, or the railway goods depot. This was the first time I saw the Volga and was greatly impressed by its beauty and majesty. Before, I had never seen a river bigger than the Protva and Moskva. The first time I glimpsed the Volga was in the early morning. The river sparkled in the rays of the rising sun. I stood staring, unable to tear my eyes away. Now I understand, I thought to myself, why so many songs are sung about it and why it is called the Mother of Rivers. Merchants and buyers from all over Russia and from abroad came to the Nizhny Novgorod fair. It was located outside the city, about halfway to Kanavino, in a low valley that was invariably inundated during the spring floods. All sorts of people came to the fair to turn an honest or dishonest penny. Thieves, prostitutes, and swindlers flocked there in droves to engage in their shady business. That year, after the Nizhny Novgorod fair, I had to go to another fair, this time in Uryupin, in the region of the Don Cossacks. My master did not go and delegated Vasily Danilov, a senior clerk. My recollections of Uryupin are paler compared to what I remember of Nizhny Novgorod and the Volga. This was a smallish, dirty town, and the fair was not large either. Vasily Danilov, the clerk, was an evil and cruel man. I still cannot understand what sadistic quirk made him strike out at me, a 14-year-old boy, at the slightest pretext. One day I could no longer stand it, caught up to an oak stick and walloped him over the head with all my strength. He fell into a swoon. I was scared. Thinking that I had killed him, I ran away and returned only when I learned he had come. Back in Moscow, he complained to the master, who, without giving me a hearing, beat me cruelly. In 1912, I was lucky to get 10 days' leave to visit my family. The time of haymaking, the most interesting type of farm job, had begun. Menfolk and the young chaps came home from the city to help the women cope more quickly with the job and stock up enough fodder for the winter. I had left the village as a child and returned as a young man getting on for 16, about to finish my apprenticeship. Many faces were missing. Some had died, others had been apprenticed out, or had gone to town in search of work. Some I failed to recognize, some failed to recognize me. Some were twisted by their hard life, by premature old age, others had grown to adulthood. To come to the village, I took the Maloya-Roslovets suburban train, standing the entire distance at the open train window. When I travelled to Moscow 4 years earlier, it was night time, and I had seen none of the scenery along the way. Now I watched with interest the station structures and the lovely woods and copses around Moscow. As we were going past Naro-Fominsk, one of the passengers observed to his neighbour, "I often visited this place before 1905. You see those red brick buildings? Those are Sava Morozov's mills." "They say he's democratic," the other said. "Yes, he's a bourgeois democrat, and they say he treats his workers not too badly, but his managers are a bunch of sharks." "They're all tarred with the same brush," the second said acidly. When they noticed that I was listening with interest, recollecting what I had heard in the coach about the factory several years back, they fell silent. I was met at Obolenskaya station by Mother. She had changed greatly and had aged in these 4 years. I could hardly speak and was barely able to restrain my tears. Mother cried and cried, hugging me close with her work-hardened, horny hands, and kept saying, "Sonny, darling, I never thought I'd see you again." "Now, Mother," I comforted her. "See what a grown-up boy I am. Now life will be easier for you." "May God grant it," she said. By the time we got home, it was dark. Father and Sister were waiting for us on the porch. Sister had grown up into a pretty girl, but Father was bent and aged. He was nearing 70. We kissed, then apparently thinking of something of his own, he said, "It's good I've lived to see you. I see you're grown up and strong." To sooner relish the delight I was sure my parents and sister would show, I unpacked my basket. I had presents for everyone. I also gave Mother 3 rubles in cash, a couple of pounds of sugar, a pound of sweets, and half a pound of tea. "Thanks ever so much," Mother was overjoyed. "It's a long time since we had real tea with sugar." I gave Father a ruble to spend at the tavern. 20 kopecks would be quite enough for him, Mother grumbled. "I've waited for the boy for 4 years, so don't spoil it with talk of our poverty," Father replied. A day later, Mother, Sister, and I went out haymaking. I was glad to see my old friends, especially my bosom pal Alexei Kolotyerny. All the boys had grown visibly. I could not get off to a good start, tiring quickly and perspiring. Evidently my 4-year absence told. Then everything went well. I cut a beautiful swathe, keeping up with the rest, though my throat and mouth ran dry, and I was more than thankful when we knocked off. "Well, Georgie, surely it's no picnic to be a farmer," Uncle Nazar observed, throwing an arm round my sweating shoulders. "That's certainly so," I said. "The English use machines to mow," a young chap I did not know said. "Very true," said Nazar. "But we here stick to our wooden plough and scythes." I asked who the chap was who spoke of machines. "Why, that's Nikolai, the village elder's son. He was expelled from Moscow for his part in 1905. He's got a razor-edged tongue and even curses the Tsar." "That's all right," Alexei Kolotyerny remarked, "as long as the cops and narcs don't hear you." The sun blazed down fiercely. We finished mowing and now dried the mown hay. By midday, Sister and I had stacked up the hay on our cart and drove home. A plate of fried potatoes with butter and a cup of sweetened tea already awaited us. I was ravenous. In the evenings we young folk, fatigue forgotten, gathered round the barn to make merry. We sang songs that gripped you at the heartstrings. The village girls led in rich, ripe voices, the young men catching up the melody in as yet unsteady basses and baritones. Then we danced till ready to drop. We broke up towards dawn, barely managing to catch a few winks of sleep before we were roused and went out mowing again. As soon as evening came, the fun started anew. It was indeed hard to say when we slept. In one's salad days, one can even go without sleep. It's good to be young. My leave flashed by, and I had to return to Moscow. The night before I was to go, a fire broke out in the neighbouring village of Kostinka. A heavy wind was blowing. The conflagration had started in the middle of the village, and soon the flames spread to the neighbouring houses, sheds, and barns. We were still up and awake, and the entire crowd of us rushed to roll out the fire barrel, reaching Kostinka even before the local fire brigade was up. The fire was big. Despite the desperate efforts of the fire brigades, which had rushed in from neighbouring villages, half the village burnt down. Running with a pail of water past a house, I heard shouts for help. I rushed to the house from which I heard the cries and dragged out several mortally frightened children and a sick old crone. At last the blaze was put out. On the smoking ruins, women moaned and children sobbed. Many were left homeless and had lost all their possessions. Some had not even a crust of bread left. The next morning I discovered that the sparks had burnt a couple of holes, each the size of a 5-kopeck coin, in my new jacket, which my master had given me, as was the custom when I was going on leave. "The boss'll be pretty nasty," Mother remarked. "So what?" I said. "Let him decide what is more important. a couple of holes in my jacket or kids saved. I left heavy-hearted, especially when I again saw the ruins and ashes, where unfortunates were poking around to see if they could salvage something. I felt compassion for them, well knowing what it meant to be homeless. I arrived in Moscow in the early morning. After greeting my master, I told him about the fire and pointed to the holes burnt in my jacket. To my surprise, he let it pass. In my heart, I was grateful. Later, I learned that I had simply been lucky. The day before, my master had sold a consignment of furs at a great profit. If not for that, Fyodor Ivanovich observed, you would have been flogged within an inch of your life. My term of apprenticeship ended in late 1912. Now I was a learned craftsman. My master asked me what I intended to do next. He wanted to know whether I would find digs for myself or continue to live in with them. If you lodge here and board with the apprentices, I'll pay you 10 rubles. If you lodge out, you'll get 18. Still very much a greenhorn, I said I would continue to live in. My master was apparently satisfied with this arrangement, for after the other craftsmen knocked off, he would always dig up an urgent but unpaid job for me. After a little while, I was fed up and said to myself I had to find lodgings, as this would give me time to do some reading in the evenings. At Christmas, I again went home, now quite an independent young man. I was 16, but more important, I was a craftsman drawing 10 rubles a month, which not many were able to make at the time. My master trusted me, having convinced himself of my honesty. He often sent me to the bank to cash a cheque or make a deposit. He also appreciated me as a worker who never refused a job, and frequently took me along with him to his shop, where besides working on the trade, I was told to pack and crate furs and dispatch them to the warehouses. I liked this more than working at the workshop, where one heard nothing but a lot of cursing the livelong day. At the shop, the atmosphere was totally different. There, a more or less intellectual crowd could often be heard discussing current events. At the workshop, none of the craftsmen read the papers, and none except for Kolosov had any notion of politics, which I suppose was pretty much the picture at all the other furrieries. We had no union in those days, and all of us were left to our own devices. A union of leather workers, incorporating us furriers, was organised a while later. The furriers, except for a few isolated cases, were conspicuous at the time for their complete political apathy. Each craftsman was concerned only for himself. Some endeavoured by hook or by crook to hoard up some money and start their own business. In fact, as concerned their petty bourgeois philosophy and absence of proletarian solidarity, the furriers, tailors, and other artisans were a far cry from factory workers, from real proletarians. The factory hand, naturally, could not even dream of starting his own business. Many thousands of rubles were needed. He got a miserable pittance, barely enough to keep body and soul together. Working conditions and the constant menace of unemployment made the factory workers unite in the struggle against their exploiters. At the time, the Bolsheviks conducted political agitation among the industrial proletariat. The artisans were mostly under the influence of Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and sundry other pseudo-revolutionaries. No wonder there were few artisans and craftsmen among the rebellious proletariat, either in 1905 or in the Great October Socialist Revolution. From 1910 to 1914, the revolutionary ferment increased visibly. Strikes flared up more and more often in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other industrial centres. Student rallies and strikes were also more frequent. Meanwhile, in the countryside, the peasants were desperate owing to the effects of the famine of 1911. Still, though the furriers were not wise to politics, we had heard of the massacre of workers at the Lena goldfields and felt the universal upswing of revolutionary ferment. Now and again, Kolesov would bring a Bolshevik paper, either Zvezda, Star, or Pravda, Truth, which explained in understandable terms why the contradictions between the workers and capitalists and between the peasants and landowners could not be reconciled, and which demonstrated the identity of the interests of the urban proletariat and the village poor. Though at the time my political knowledge was less than rudimentary, I clearly realized that these papers voiced worker and peasant interests. Ruskoye Slovo, Russian word, and Moskovskie Vedomosti, Moscow News, on the other hand, were the mouthpieces of the capitalists who dominated in Tsarist Russia. When I went home, I was already able to tell of and explain some things to my fellow villagers. I remember the outbreak of the First World War, mostly because of the raids on foreign-owned shops in Moscow. Exploiting patriotic sentiments, secret police agents and Black Hundred gangs sacked German and Austrian firms, involving many looters. Since the common people knew no foreign tongues, they raided French and British firms too. Because of the propaganda, many young fellows, spurred by patriotic sentiments, especially from among the well-to-do, volunteered for the front. My cousin Alexander had also made up his mind to run away to the front and insistently persuaded me to follow suit. I rather liked the idea at first, but decided to ask Fyodor Ivanovich, in my eyes an unimpeachable authority, for advice. He heard me out and then said, "I can understand why Alexander wants to go. He's got a rich father and so has got what to fight for. But you, ninny, what have you got to fight for? For your father having been chased out of Moscow, or for your mother all swelling up with hunger? You'll come back a cripple, and no one will want you." This convinced me, and I told Alexander I would not go. He cursed me and ran away that night, to be brought back with grave wounds just a couple of months later. I was still at the workshop, but had lodgings in Okhotny Ryad, across the road from where Hotel Moskva now towers. I rented a cot for 3 rubles a month from one Malisheva, a widow whose daughter Maria I fell in love with. We were about to get married, but as often happens, the war upset all our plans. Because of the heavy losses at the front, young men not yet 20, born in 1895, were inducted before their time. My turn was soon due. I did not feel too enthusiastic about it, as at every step I saw unfortunate cripples back from the front. A striking contrast to the children of the rich who spent their time dashing around Moscow in posh carriages, betting at the horse races, or celebrating drunken orgies at the former Yar restaurant. Still, I thought that when my turn came, I would fight honestly for my country. At the end of July 1915, young men of my age were being drafted. I asked my master for leave to go home to say goodbye to my parents, and also lend them a hand with the harvesting. I was called up at the district seat of Maloyaroslavets in Kaluga province on August 7, 1915, when the First World War was already in full swing. I was assigned to the cavalry and was very happy to serve in it, for I entertained many romantic feelings about it. My chums were recruited into the infantry, and many envied me. A week later, all conscripts were called out to the induction centre. We were broken into lots, and I parted with my chums. All around me were strangers, as green and callow as myself. Towards dusk, we entered and headed for Kaluga. I felt a gnawing loneliness. My youth was over. Was I really prepared to perform a soldier's onerous duties and go into battle if need be? Inured by previous hardships, I hoped I would do my duty honourably. The goods wagons into which we were crammed, 40 men apiece, were not adapted to carrying people. One had the choice of either standing all the way or sitting on the filthy floor. Some of the men sang, some played cards, some sobbed on their neighbours' shoulders, some sat gritting their teeth, staring vacuously, and reflecting on their soldiers' future. We arrived in Kaluga at night and were told to line up on the goods siding. We then marched away from the town. Someone asked the corporal where we were going. He must have been a nice fellow, for he gave us the following advice. "Look here, men, never ask your superiors such questions. The soldier's got to do everything he's told and ask no questions. Where he goes is for his superiors to know." As if to confirm this, there rang out from the head of our column, "Quit talking in the ranks!" Nikolai Sivtsov, my new pal, poked me in the ribs and whispered, "Well, there you are. We're in the army now." We had been slogging along for some 3 hours when a brief halt was called. It was near daybreak. We flung ourselves down on the ground, and almost at once snores were heard. We were soon ordered to fall in again, and after another hour reached camp. Here we were put up on bare boards in a hut holding already some 100 men. Though the wind whistled freely through the many cracks and shattered window panes, The stench was terrible. We were told we could rest till 7 o'clock. After breakfast, we were lined up and told that we were with the 189th Reserve Infantry Battalion, where a detachment for the 5th Reserve Cavalry Regiment would be activated. Prior to being sent to our assignment, we would be taught ordinary drill. We were issued training rifles. Corporal Shakvorostov, our squad commander, announced the rules, regulations, and duties. He warned us that we could not fall out except to attend to the call of nature if we didn't want to be sent to the stockade. Each word that he snapped out, he stressed with a sweep of his fist. His tiny eyes glittered menacingly, as if we were his sworn enemies. "Can't expect anything good from him," one man said. The senior NCO came up, and our corporal rapped out, "Shun!" "I'm your platoon commander, Malyavko," said the senior NCO. "I hope you've all understood what your squad commander said and will loyally serve Tsar and country. I will tolerate no insubordination." Our first day of infantry drill began. Every one of us tried hard to do the evolution well, but it was not easy to please our superiors or earn commendation. Picking on a man who had fallen out of step, the platoon commander kept all of us at extra drill. As a result, the slops we had for dinner were cold when we got them. I was depressed. All I wanted was to turn in for the night. However, as if reading our minds, the platoon commander ordered us to fall in and announced that tomorrow night we would have evening roll call, and that therefore tonight we had to learn the national anthem, God Save the Tsar. This choir continued till late at night, and at 6 a.m. we were roused for morning exercises. The days, one so much like the other, rolled in dreary monotony. Then came our first Sunday. We thought we would have respite and would take a bath, but we were marched out for fatigue detail. This continued till the midday meal. After the siesta, we cleaned our weapons, patched and darned, and wrote letters home. Our corporal warned us not to complain in letters home, because that sort of thing would be cut out by the censors anyway. It was hard to accustom oneself to army routine, but we had had it none too easy before, and after about a fortnight most of us felt broken in. After a couple of weeks of training, our platoon was lined up for inspection by Captain Volodin, the company commander. He was said to be a heavy drinker, whom it was best to avoid when he was in his cups. Outwardly, though, he seemed no different from the other officers. We could see, however, that for him the inspection parade held no interest. After a short speech, he wound up by urging us to display zeal. "God repays you for your prayer and the Tsar for your service." Before we were transferred to the 5th Reserve Cavalry Regiment, we saw the company commander a few more times, and invariably he seemed to be drunk. As for the commanding officer of the 189th Reserve Battalion, we never saw him once during our training. In September 1915 we were sent to our regiment, which was quartered in the town of Balakleya in Kharkov province in the Ukraine. We bypassed the town and came to the railway station of Savintsy, where replacements were being marshalled for the 10th Cavalry Division. On the platform, we were met by smartly dressed cavalry NCOs. Their different uniforms denoted that they were from the Hussars, the Uhlans, and the Dragoons. Our group from Maloyaroslavets, Moscow, and a few young chaps from Voronezh province were assigned to a squadron of dragoons. We were disappointed that it was not the Hussars, and not only because they had nattier uniforms. We had been told that the NCOs there were more decent, and in the Tsarist army the soldier's entire life depended on his NCOs. A day later we were issued our cavalry uniforms and all the other accoutrements and were assigned horses. I drew a shrewish dark grey mare by the name of Chashechnaya. Though service in the cavalry was much more interesting than in the infantry, we had a much harder time. Besides general drill, we had to learn horsemanship and the use of sidearms, and we curried our horses 3 times a day. Reveille was at 5 a.m. and not at 6 as in the infantry, and taps also came an hour later. Hardest of all was the horsemanship and the use of sabre and lance. Many of us had blisters drawing blood, but complaints were forbidden. We were told to grin and bear it, and we did as best we could until we were finally able to sit straight in the saddle. Our platoon commander, Senior NCO Durakov, was, despite his name, which meant fool, quite a clever person. Though most exacting, he was fair and reserved. Our other commander, however, Junior NCO Borodavko, was his complete opposite, a blustering bully who would lash out for no reason at all. Veterans said that he had knocked out soldiers' teeth more than once. He was especially ruthless when in charge of our riding drill. When Durakov went on a brief furlough for family reasons, he did all he could to break us. In the daytime he rode us until we were half dead, picking especially on those who had lived and worked in Moscow, as he considered them bookworms and too big for their boots. At night he inspected the posted sentinels, mercilessly pummelling those whom he caught napping. The men were driven to despair. One day we trapped him in a dark corner and, throwing a horsecloth over his head, beat him up till he was unconscious. We would certainly have been court-martialed if not for the return of our platoon commander, who hushed the matter up and then had Borodavko transferred to another squadron. By the spring of 1916 we were essentially a well-trained cavalry unit. We were told that we would soon receive marching orders, but would continue field training pending departure for the front lines. New recruits, 1 year our juniors, took our places as we prepared to move to other quarters in the village of Lagary. Some 30 of our best men were picked for NCO training courses, and I was one of them. I did not particularly relish the idea, but our platoon commander, whom I greatly respected for his decency, cleverness, and friendly disposition to us men, persuaded me to file my application. "You'll still have time to get to the front," he said. "First, learn soldiering a bit more. I'm sure you'll make a pretty good NCO." Then, after some reflection, he added, "I, for one, am in no hurry to go back to the front. I had a year there, and it taught me a lot. It's a pity our folk die so senselessly. What for, I ask you?" He said nothing more, but I realized that deep down he could not reconcile his army service with the feelings of a man who could no longer brook Tsarist despotism. I thanked him for his advice and agreed to join the training course in the town of Izyum in Kharkov province. There were about 240 of us there, from different units. We were billeted in private quarters, and soon our training began. Unfortunately, we had a savage senior NCO, even worse than Borodavko. I don't remember his name, only that he was nicknamed 4½, because a phalange was missing on the index finger of his right hand. This did not prevent him from knocking a soldier down with one swipe of his fist. Though he seemed to dislike me more than the others, for some reason he never struck me. But he picked on me at the slightest pretext and subjected me to all sorts of punishments. I guess I must have done more pack drill, KP, and extra Sunday detail than anyone else. I knew that it was all due to the frustrations of an exceedingly doltish and unkind man. On the other hand, I was glad that he could never find fault with me during classes. Seeing evidently that he could not get me down, he decided to change his tactics, and perhaps simply to divert me from my training, in which I was making better progress than the rest. One day he summoned me to his tent and said, "Look here, I see you're strong-minded, educated, and learn easily. You're a Muscovite, a worker. Why sweat every day at drill? You be my clerk, off the roster, and do all the paperwork and other tasks." I told him I had joined the course not to be somebody's errand boy, but to learn the job properly and be a good NCO. He grew red in the face and threatened, "All right, you'll never be an NCO, I'll see to that." The course was to end in June, and we were to pass our exams. According to the regulations, the top man passed out as a junior NCO, with the others receiving only candidate rank. My mates had not the slightest doubt that I would get first place and be made an NCO and a squad commander as soon as there was a vacancy. It came as a surprise to everyone when a fortnight before the exams it was announced at roll call that I was being discharged for insubordination and disloyalty to my immediate superior. All realized that 4½ was settling scores with me. However, there was nothing to be done. Help came, though, from quite an unexpected quarter. One of the trainees, Scorino by name, who was a volunteer and not a drafted man like the rest of us, happened to be the brother of the second-in-command officer in my former squadron. Though he made poor progress and had no fancy for the army, he was a pleasant and sociable fellow whom our 4½ feared. He immediately informed the course chief of the injustice that was being done to me. Summoned to appear before the commander, I fell into a funk, as I had never spoken to an officer before. I thought it was curtains for me, that I would be packed off to the stockade. We knew very little about the training course chief, only that he had been promoted for gallantry, had been decorated with St. George crosses of almost every class, and that before the war he had served in the Uhlans as an extended service NCO. We had seen him only a few times at evening roll call. It was said he was unwell after being wounded. To my astonishment, I saw a man with gentle, I would even say warm, eyes in a kind, open face. "Well, it looks as if you're not too lucky," he said, motioning me to be seated. I kept standing, too scared to sit down. "Take a seat, I won't eat you. I hear you're from Moscow." "Yes, sir," I replied loudly. "I'm a Muscovite too. Before the army I was a cabinet maker, but I seem stuck here in the army," he quietly observed. After a pause he continued, "You seem to have a bad name. They say that in 4 months of training you've chalked up a dozen demerits and that you cuss your platoon commander behind his back. Is that true?" "Yes, sir," I replied. "But, sir, I can say that in my place any other man would do the same." I gave him the full picture. He heard me out and said, "Go back to your platoon and prepare for your exams." I was happy it had all panned out. Still, I did not get first place. I got candidate rank like all the rest. As I now recollect the NCO course in the old army, I must say that it provided good training, especially in marching drill. The graduate was a good horseman, adept in the use of weapons, and a good drill master. No wonder that after the Great October Revolution, many NCOs of the old army rose to prominence as commanders in the Red Army. As for the general training, drill was all important. The future NCO was not taught the human approach. He was expected to mould the soldier into a pliant robot. Discipline was maintained by harshness. Though regulations did not stipulate corporal punishment, it was rather common. So much has been written about the old Russian army that I do not think I should mention more than a few points that could be of interest. The salient feature of the old Tsarist army was the total absence of any rapport between the ranks and the officers. However, during the course of the war, especially in 1916 and early 1917, when the heavily depleted officer corps had to draw for replenishments on working intellectuals, factory workers, and peasants with some amount of schooling, as well as on rankers and NCOs commended for gallantry, this estrangement was somewhat surmounted in army units up to battalion strength. It remained intact in all larger formations, however. Generals and officers had no affinity with the rank and file, and had no idea of what went on in the minds of the men. Because of this, and also due to their poor knowledge of tactics, most generals and officers, with the exception of a few, enjoyed no prestige among the soldiers.